a new theory for explaining unique features of humans. So I'll be coming back to this video later. But I'm going to explain to you why only humans can do this. But basically, my talk's going to consist of 3 parts: some background information, some presentation of the theory itself, and as time allows, some of the supporting evidence, implications, and consequences. I think what I'm going to do is, as I finish each of these sections, stop and ask for a few questions. We won't be able to have a continuous, we'll have to keep on time, so we may have to break the questions and come back at the end to pick up things. So let's go into the background. The oldest questions of humans are, who are we? What are we doing here? Where did we come from? How did we get here? And where are we going? And 2 of these questions are actually amenable to scientific inquiry and form the basis of the subject of anthropogeny, which is an old word which essentially means investigating the origin of humans. And this is what people like Chris and me and many others are interested in. Oops. And this subject, of course, requires you to include all academic disciplines, ranging all the way from humanities and social sciences to physical and chemical and climate science. And so we bring together all these different kinds of people in this group called CARTA that was mentioned. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to go to this website, especially look at some of the symposia, the earlier symposia, the videos, which are also available on YouTube and iTunes. Almost any subject you can think of related to this question of anthropogeny we've touched on at some point, and we'll be doing more in the future, and there are more symposia coming up in the future. So, as Chris emphasized, and actually this is Chris's intellectual godfather, Dobzhansky, said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, because all of biology is a product of evolution. So really, I should rephrase my title to be Mind Over Reality, a new theory for explaining unique features of human evolution. Because if you want to explain unique features of humans, you have to explain unique features of human evolution. So here's a human-centric view of the universe. The origin of the universe about 13 billion plus years ago, the origin of life about 3.5 billion years ago, 500 million years ago, the Great Cambrian expansion, the emergence of primates about the time the dinosaurs disappeared, emergence of apes about 20 million years ago, genus Homo 2.3 million years ago, and us 100,000 years ago. So I played a trick, of course. This is a logarithmic scale, right? Makes us look very prominent. But of course, in reality, there are 3 domains of life: bacteria, eukarya, and archaea, with some degree of gene transfer going on early on and still ongoing in the prokaryotes. And we are basically vertebrates with a common ancestor about 300 million years ago, ranging all the way from birds to marsupials. And among these vertebrates, we are primates. And if you zoom in further here, in primate phylogeny, start about 60 million years ago, give or take, you come into looking at the great apes here, and we humans are just a tiny little branch coming off there. And the hominids, are humans and related species living today, are basically just us and a few great apes. So of course, we tend to see these kind of pictures, right, in popular literature. Or perhaps we think that somewhere something went terribly wrong, right? So I put up these amusing slides not just to emphasize evolution, but to point out that we did not evolve from chimpanzees. We shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees. So we shared a common ancestor with orangutans first, gorillas next, chimpanzees and bonobos next. And the remarkable fact is that while we classified all these species as great apes, and maybe an alien anthropologist would do the same, this is an entirely incorrect classification, because we are closer to the bonobo and the chimpanzee than they are to the gorilla. As Jared Diamond suggested, we are a 3rd chimpanzee, right? And so in fact, these are now the hominids, and the species leading up to humans are called hominins. So why am I doing this? You heard that I'm trained in internal medicine, hematology, and oncology. It's a long story which I won't get into in this lecture. But basically, several years ago, almost 2 decades ago, we happened to find the first genetic difference between humans and chimpanzees. People had been looking for a long time. And we found a biochemical defect in a gene called CMAH, which has many influences on human-like features, and which we've been studying ever since then. And since then, we've found, in fact, there are many other human-like genetic changes in sialic acid biology as well as in other fields. And so over the years, I've evolved, I guess is the correct word, from being a physician scientist to being more of an anthropogenist, and now writing reviews on genetic and genomic features unique to the human lineage. So basically, this explains my common interest now in sialic acid biology, uniquely human diseases, 2 areas I won't talk about, and anthropogeny, which I'm going to talk about today. So a key question is, how different are humans and chimpanzees? If you talk to Jane Goodall or Tetsuro Matsuzawa, they would point out that chimpanzees are remarkably similar to humans. Every day something comes up in the news and you say, wow, we didn't realize they were just like us. Again and again, the evidence. On the other hand, if you talk to unbiased observers like John Cohen, Jeremy Taylor, who are science writers, they say, wait a minute, humans are remarkably different from chimpanzees. Actually, both conclusions are correct. It depends on which one you're interested in. And I'm interested in what makes us different. So not to put down chimpanzees at all, but I'm interested in what made us different from chimpanzees. So of course, we have to look at all our relatives and ancestors that you hear about in all the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, etc. And usually you see these trees going upwards. And I don't like the trees going upwards because, as I drew earlier, because it suggests some kind of ascendancy. Actually, evolution occurs downwards, right? The descent of species. But for practical reasons, that's hard to see on a slide, so we put it left to right. Jesse Roby drew these things for me. This is the hominin fossil record, which is already hopelessly out of date as of now. In the just last 2 years, there's some phenomenal new discoveries in this general area. I won't go through all these species, but basically the genus Homo emerges about 2 million years ago, give or take, and and goes out all over the old world to different parts, all the way from Java to China to Europe. And out in Europe emerges Neanderthals, and then us in Africa. So remember that genus Homo spread all across the old world and left various lineages like Neanderthals, Denisovans, probably others in Africa, and many others that we probably haven't discovered yet. And then we humans emerged and replaced everybody else. So the current evidence suggests that all humans on Earth arose from a few thousand ancestors living about 100 to 300,000 years ago in Africa. All of you in this room. As my colleague Pascal Gagneux showed, a group of chimpanzees in West Africa, a large group, have a greater genetic diversity than all the humans on the planet. So we are from a very narrow origin. But of course, you've probably heard all the stories about how we interbred with other species, and this is really true, of course. We not only admixed with Neanderthals, Denisovans, other species, but also with other archaic African hominins. And so really, in a sense, we were like, I'm not going to put up the picture, but the macaque monkeys, of which there are different species across the planet, or bears, that there are different species across the planet. But the remarkable thing is that when we emerged, we behaviorally modern species, humans as we're called, replaced all the other closely related species, just picking up tiny bits of their DNA. So it is as if the grizzly bears of North America came out and replaced all the other bears on the planet, or the Asian macaque replaced all the macaques on the planet, with limited interbreeding and a little bit of genetic intromission. So I'd like to say that this is rather different from what happened in most other groups of related species. In fact, I've been challenging ecologists like Chris to give me an example on the history of this planet where a single subspecies or related species essentially took over the planet and replaced everybody else. So I think this is a mystery that needs to be solved. So again, another way of looking at it, these different lineages were out there in the last 250,000 years, and these anatomically modern humans were in Africa, and somewhere along the way they became behaviorally modern humans, and everybody else disappeared, basically, with a little bit of bits and pieces of DNA in a few of us, but very few real genes incorporated from them, although there are a few examples. So effectively, we became, as Chris Stringer and Ian Tattersall called, the lone survivors and the masters of the planet. And, you know, there's this phrase, human exceptionalism. And if you put it in Google and search for it, you'll find only derogatory comments about it. The idea is, oh, we're humans, so the Victorian idea that we are this superior species, superior to all. And admittedly, that's a very bad way of thinking of things, because we tend to ruin the planet when we think that way. On the other hand, I think we've got to the other extreme, saying, oh, we're just another chimpanzee. Excuse me, but chimpanzees are not holding Darwin Day, and they're not going to be doing so very soon. So how did humans evolve these mental differences from great apes? Everybody's heard of Charles Darwin, the name of the symposium today. How many of you have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace? Oh, good, quite a few have heard. So he was actually the simultaneous co-discoverer of natural selection. They published the first paper, the abstract was published, Darwin and Wallace. You don't hear much about Wallace. There are many reasons for this. One is he gave perhaps too much credit to Darwin, and the other is he had some strange ideas in other fields. But one of the reasons I found is that he questioned whether natural selection could account for the evolution of the human mind. And so, you know, everybody went against him and said, come on, that's ridiculous. And of course, natural selection gave rise to the human mind as Chris points out. But here's what was bothering Wallace, which I think we should look back on. He said, how could natural selection at all favor the development of mental powers so entirely removed from the material necessities of savage men? In other words, he said, I can take newborn babies from the jungles of Borneo and bring them to England, and if I give them enough opportunity, they can be Englishmen. And I recently wrote a piece that said if you took 1,000 babies from, say, San Bushmen in Africa, or from 100,000 years ago in Africa, brought them to California, and gave them every opportunity, 2 generations later, they would be part of the University of California, Berkeley, and you wouldn't be able to tell them apart on the phone. So Wallace suggested that an instrument was developed in advance of the needs of its predecessor. And he felt this can only be met by discovery of new facts or new laws of a nature very different from yet known to us. Now, of course, it's all natural selection, but here's a candidate mechanism, which is really the end result of the process that Chris was describing of the emergence and progress of the vertebrate brain. We humans are characterized particularly by prolonged helplessness with extended nurturing occurring in the context of mental maturation during an extended neoteny or fetal-like state of the nervous system. Notice I've managed to get the word phenomenon in there. So we use this extended development plasticity to invent, disseminate, improve, and culturally transmit complex behaviors over generations without the need to hardwire. It appears that we may have learned how to control fire about 1 million years ago. But we humans are not born with the ability to control fire. After 1 million years, somebody still has to teach you. So in a sense, we've offloaded what natural selection is to put into the genome onto culture. Pascal, my friend, recently pointed out me a quote from somewhere. Nothing in human evolution makes sense except in the light of culture. So I think both statements are true there too. So innovation and imitation. So you have a population. There's a few innovators, rare innovators. You have imitators. Humans are fantastic at imitating things. So, you know, the zero did not exist until about 400 AD, came out of India. And nobody knew anything about it, and now a 5-year-old can tell you what a zero is. So innovation, imitation, and then you get population expansion. So notice the number of innovators is increasing, right, as you go along. and you're expanding everything. But then you have communication. Of course, many other animals have communication, but we have the best forms of communication. I think nobody would argue with that. Even more important is teaching. So it's not just communication from one to another. We can do what I'm doing right now, communicate to a large group. Maybe this video may be shown somewhere else, and I'll communicate with even further. Okay, so now I'm going to present a new theory. So whenever I give a talk like what I just gave, you can be guaranteed somebody will come up to you and give you their favorite theory. Every human has their favorite theory about where we came from, right? So 2005, University of Arizona, I sit down for lunch and this guy sits next to me and says, "You're all asking the wrong question." I said, "Really, Danny?" So he gives me this wonderful idea, which I'd never heard before. So I said, "Danny, you should write this up." We sat and talked for an hour and a half. Everybody left. He said, "Yeah, I'm working on something. I might write up something." So some time went by, and I started thinking about what Danny had said. And essentially, here's what he had said. If you look at that same pattern of vertebrates I told you about, which of these species are self-aware? All species are aware of environment and the situation, but self-aware meaning recognize myself as myself. So how do you test this? Well, there are many different ways to test this, and one of them is the so-called mirror self-recognition test.
This 3-year-old chimpanzee has never seen a mirror before.
Can you hear that in the back?
He's not sure what to make of it.
So most animals look at a mirror and say, "What the hell is this thing?" But once they get used to it,
Erect fur is usually a sign of fear or anger. But his fear is soon replaced by curiosity.
now his mother, who's been using the mirror much longer, says, "Oh, there's something stuck in my teeth."
Chimpanzees seem to have a concept of the bodily self that allows them to look into a mirror and say, that image is equivalent to this body. But how can we prove that humans and chimpanzees really identify the figure in the mirror as themselves? Psychologists have a well-known test for this. It's called the mark test. A researcher marks a child's cheek. The child then looks in a mirror.
So that's me.
Up to the mark. He recognizes himself. By the age of 2, half of all children tested can recognize themselves. Soon they all do.
So this works for multiple species of apes. Turns out it works in dolphins. Now this is a one-way mirror. The dolphin can't see you. Dolphin can see itself in the mirror. Diana Reese and others have shown, obviously the dolphin can't reach over and touch the spot, but once you do the spot test and the dolphin figures it out, they think this is really cool. They start examining themselves. In fact, I got this video from the original paper that Diana had, because this particular dolphin would race out as soon as the keepers came, said, "Please put a spot on my forehead. I want to go take a look at myself in the mirror," you know. And so this is a very consistent behavior among most dolphins. So you could argue, as Danny Povinelli has said, that this is just some kind of image recognition. That's a bodily recognition. How do you know it's me, right? A person or something. So it's very hard to prove, but Derek Denton took some of these chimps that had already recognized, they already knew the mirror business quite well, and put them in front of a circus mirror. So chimp comes in and, you know, there's one of these distorting mirrors. So what the hell is that? So what the chimps eventually do is they start experimenting. They move around, they watch the mirror for a while, and pretty soon Derek reports that what happens is they eventually figure out, that's just me, it's a bad mirror, and they leave, basically. So they can figure out even a distorted image of themselves. So the same thing has been done in dolphins and apes I showed you, but with a very large mirror in a few Asian elephants. And actually, in magpies, certain corvid birds have shown this. Now, on the other hand, in each of these, there may be a hyrax here, there may be a rabbit and a rodent here, there may be, dogs are a special case, they can't do it. Most carnivores, most marsupials, they can't do it. Notice the little red color here. This has evolved independently several times. Self-awareness has emerged independently several times, right? So it's a pretty advanced function. So I thought about this, and I was going to try to get hold of Danny to say, you got to write this up, and I'll explain to you what his idea was. And instead I found his obituary. He had dropped dead suddenly. So I wrote a letter to Nature about his idea called Human Uniqueness and the Denial of Death, and talked about Danny's idea and my embellishments of it. By this time, I'd gotten very interested in human origins. And I won't read through this except to say that I suggested that many features of humans could be explained by his theory. So what is he talking about? Now, from now on, everything I say is really Danny and me, because I only met him for an hour and a half, and it's not fair, he's not here, so I just give him equal credit. So basically, you saw that a 2-year-old human has some kind of first-order intentionality, self-awareness. Then you get what is called rudimentary theory of mind, or a term that I thought would work, which is you can kind of understand the minds of others a little bit. Then you get full theory of mind, a 5-year-old child. There's a thing called the false belief test, where they can understand the minds of others. And you know for sure this has happened because they start telling lies. They start telling very, very effective lies. You know that this. Now they can really read your mind, and they can read the minds of the others around them, and they get better and better at it. And eventually, we adult humans have what I would call extended theory of mind, multi-order intentionality. I mean, look at the internet, for example. It's a connective of billions of brains coming together, or what we're doing right now. So this is really a continuum. I don't want to imply that it's a stepwise progression. It's kind of a continuum. And if you think of humans' features, there's this website called Mocha at Carta that lists the features that make humans different from other animals, and these are some of the cognitive ones. Think of theory of mind, acting. In order to act, you have to read the mind of the people in the audience. The audience has to read your mind. You don't even have to speak. You can mime, right? Caring for the infirm and the elderly. How can you make laws unless you had theory of mind, right? How can you have organized sports? Nobody talks. But you have two groups of people who are reading each other's minds, trying to read the minds of the others, and everybody's got to read the mind of the referee, right? Reputation spreads much faster with theory of mind. Teaching. No other species has been shown to do true teaching. Imitation, yes. General instruction, yes, but not teaching, as I'm doing right now. Torture. You can't really torture somebody else unless you can read their minds, and nobody can torture like humans. And trade. Giving something away in response to getting something else later from someone else. You've got to be able to read minds. So basically, if you saw the movie Rain Man and think about Dustin Hoffman as the autistic savant, very smart individual, but if everybody was like that individual, none of these things would happen. And I can go on and on. There's numerous human features that require this thing called theory of mind. And there are several different words for it. It's a complex field of psychology, but you get the idea of what it is I'm trying to talk about. Not only being aware of yourself, but being aware of the self-awareness of the other individual, and together being aware of the awareness of another individual. So why is it uniquely human? So this is really what Danny was asking, in a sense. You've got all these species with self-awareness. It's been around for a couple of 100 million years. It's a pretty advanced state of mind. Why is it so difficult going from being aware of yourself? By the way, all the other species I mentioned, they fail these kind of tests. You look for the true evidence of false belief. They come right to the edge, as if they're trying to cross something, but they don't make it. So Daniel Dennett said that any theory that makes progress is bound to be initially counterintuitive. And this is even worse because it's a theory by a dead insect geneticist, that was Danny, and myself, a physician who claimed to have understood the human mind, right? So it's unlikely that the experts will easily accept it. But keep your mind open. So here's the suggestion. On the left side is the progression that I mentioned. Here's a human going through its ontogeny. Here is all these animals and birds. And the suggestion is, and this is the part that's completely different, which really struck me when Danny said this. Everything else, everybody else is saying natural selection, the human brain got better and better and better, and here we are. Makes perfect sense. That's how natural selection works. Instead, I've coined a term to suggest what Danny was saying, an evolutionary barrier. This is like going from water to land. You don't just suddenly get up and do it. Things have to go just right, and you try many times and fail numerous times. In fact, species have been doing that forever. It's happened only a few times that species have moved on to land. So similarly, a psychological evolutionary barrier. So what might that barrier be? That we are arguing has stopped everybody else in their tracks. So by the way, in a sense, what we're also saying is that by now there should have been a human-like elephant. There should have been a human-like crow. There should have been a human-like dolphin. We should be competing with 3 or 4 other smart species, not just taking over them and destroying them all so easily. Why did it happen only once? So unfortunately, when something happened only once, you can never be sure. But here is a sort of complex slide in which I go through this. All of the species I mentioned tend to have long lives, warm-blooded, tend to have complex social organization. There's this idea of social selection for increasing intelligence. The more complicated your society becomes, the more intelligence you need. There's a lot of evidence for that. Maybe self-awareness starts emerging in that course of that, some kind of rudimentary theory of mind. Very important. In the same lineages, you have the maternal instinct and empathy. And this is emerging and becoming prominent. Sarah Hrdy has pointed out that humans are particularly unusual in having, not unique, but unusual in having very helpless young. So you have to have cooperative breeding, which works best if you can read each other's minds. And if you can read the mind of the child and the child can read your mind. So all of these things will be feeding back. So these are all standard theories out there right now for which there's a lot of evidence. But I don't think this buys you full theory of mind yet. It should, actually. In fact, any of these lineages should have been just developing and gotten to full theory of mind by this point, right? So what's the problem? What is this barrier? Observing the death of another individual. I'm suggesting that is the psychological evolutionary barrier. So why am I saying that? All animals, in fact, even insects have some awareness of death risk, right? They get out of the way when there's danger. And many animals have awareness of death risk, and it probably arises to higher and higher levels of awareness. At some point, you become aware of the death of another individual, and you've all heard stories about elephants and dolphins and so on that react to death. But then at some point, this has to be translated to understanding the mortality. That's a very important word. Mortality is different from death awareness. You can be aware of a death, but being aware of mortality is more than that. And then understanding personal mortality comes next. So again, another continuum. So here's a quote from Jack London about White Fang, the wolf. He had no conscious knowledge of death, but like every animal of the wild, he possessed the instincts of death. To him it stood as the greatest of hurts. It was the very essence of the unknown, the sum of the terrors of the unknown, the one culminating in unthinkable catastrophe that could happen, about which he knew nothing, but he feared everything. So in other words, most species have a built-in fear of death. They don't necessarily understand exactly what death is, but they know how to get out of the way if there's a danger of death. Curious. Awareness of self, independent of evolution of self-awareness. If I substitute crows, which are related species, for magpies there, these are the species that are showing evidence of death awareness. Dolphin behavior, elephant behavior, chimpanzee behavior, crow behavior following death. By the way, it's a future Carter Symposium we're working on, awareness of death. So awareness of death has also been around for a little while, right? Just understanding something bad happened here. But you need to translate that to understanding mortality. So Ernst Becker said, we know the human animal is characterized by two great fears, the fear of life and the fear of death. Voltaire said, the human race is the only one who knows it's going to die, and it knows this only through experience. This is from the Mahabharata. I'm from India. This is, 5,000 years old. The Yaksha said, what is the greatest surprise? Yudhishthira replied, people die every day, making us aware that men are mortal. Yet we live, work, play, plan as if assuming we're not immortal. What is more surprising than that? So the argument goes like this, that if you have rudimentary theory of mind and don't fully understand the minds of the other individual, and you observe a death, there's an incomplete awareness. You have some reaction, some limited consequences. But if you're that first individual in any of these lineages I'm talking about that understands the minds of the others, it should be good, right? If you say an elephant in Africa and you get theory of mind, you can take over, you can tell lies, you can dominate. Then your friend dies. And you say, oh shit, that means I'm going to die. So what are you going to do? You're going to hide in a corner. That very self-same built-in mechanism of fear would now be actualized. That evolutionary honed fear would come out, and you'd go into a state of anxiety, terror, and self-protection. You would be unlikely to succeed in passing your genes on. So the argument is that this would result in failure to reproduce and failure to propagate. So every time full theory of mind comes up, a kind of an existential crisis and failure to propagate. So what's the solution? That's the book that I finished with Danny. And I didn't tell you this. When I was contacted by his widow, who gave me his incomplete book. So I completed his book. That's the solution. Denial. What do I mean by denial? It has many meanings. An unconscious defense mechanism characterized by refusal to acknowledge painful realities, thoughts, or feelings. So here's where I want to come back to this image I showed you earlier. This is from my native country of India. A scene you will see every day. Watch these people. Probably 10% of these people either have a loved one or a close relative who died on the roads of India. What are they doing? They're reading everybody's mind, right? Full theory of mind. Can you imagine another species managing to do this? No, they say, oh, there's that crazy bus driver, I got to watch out for him. Oh, that lady on a scooter is probably safe. Watch out for that pedestrian. And now look at that one. Then eventually somebody will come out and organize things even. This requires full theory of mind and mortality denial. So here's the proof of the theory in one picture. So the argument is that full theory of mind, reality denial emerged at the same time in the same brains. You got reality, mortality denial. Now you can ignore the death risk. Maybe other mechanisms, tolerance, successful reproduction, benefits of theory of mind. Now it goes on steroids. You may have already had language, you may have already had all kinds of other things, and amazing brain abilities. You get theory of mind, bang, everything takes off, culture takes off. What else do you get? What is optimism? Denial of reality. What is extreme optimism? extreme denial of reality. Right? My grandfather was a friend of Gandhi. I grew up learning about him. What the heck was this man thinking? He's going to take on the British Empire with non-violence? What a ridiculous idea. Totally crazy optimistic. Theory of mind, it works, but he pays the price, but then you get Martin Luther King and Mandela. So you get optimism in the bargain once you go through this barrier. And as my friend Pascal Gagnon pointed out, this is, self-deception now comes in, right? And theory of mind and denial. It's a great mating strategy, especially for males. And so we would get modern humans. This is the argument, basically. So you think about it. Here's Calvin says that cloud of stars is our galaxy, the Milky Way, our solar system on the edge of it. We hurl through an incomprehensible darkness. In cosmic terms, we are subatomic particles, a grain of sand on an infinite beach. So in other words, all of you are holograms made up of subatomic particles that came from the Big Bang. You're here for this tiny, tiny period of time, and it's totally, totally, absolutely meaningless. So why is it that you're going to get up out of here and say, no, I'm going to succeed? I wonder what's on TV now. So here's the basic idea, that the argument is that full theory of mind, not right now, now it's a wonderful thing. The first time it emerges in the first individuals, gives you awareness of mortality and death anxiety, and you fail to establish it. Reality denial by itself is not a very safe thing. If you're a wildebeest that decides to go check out the lions, you're not going to last very long, right? So reality denial, you can have a few risk-taking animals in a particular group, but too much risky behavior and you're gone. Failure to establish. So you combine the two together in the same minds at the same place in the same time. So two very rare negatives have to come together at the same minds, establish combination. Now you're through the wormhole or the gap. So this, I've suggested this be called the mind over reality transition. When did it occur? Remember this picture of where we came from. I suggest that it's like a murder mystery. What happened, right? So when something happens only once, you've got to keep an open mind, right? So it could have been factors like climate, geology, anatomy, infection. We have some evidence for that. Behavior, cognition, psychology, language, etc. I think it was this theory of mind over reality transition that took these anatomically modern Homo sapiens, whose archaeology doesn't show much evidence of anything unusual, into this phase, and gave us both things, theory of mind and optimism and risk-taking behavior. It so happens that's about the time you start seeing communicative art in Africa, about the time you start seeing shell beads. Why would you make a bead unless you wanted somebody else to respond to you, right? Death rituals, burials. Why would you bury somebody? Neanderthals did a few burials, but they don't have grave goods in them. That's an interesting, maybe the Neanderthals are right on the brink of this transition too. Now let's look at ontogeny and phylogeny. We've gone through the same steps that I showed you. 5-year-old humans in non-religious families start asking, what is death? What's going to happen? What happened to grandma? Don't worry about it, because they'll soon become invincible teenagers. So I think that Australopiths, Homo erectus, anatomically modern humans are sitting on the same brink that we now see in our ontogeny, and we made the transition there. So again, the same idea, these two maladaptations became combined. So this theory has several benefits. It can explain why only we have full theory of mind. Explain why we have this ability for reality denial. And we'll come into the consequences. Strong tendency for self-deception and false beliefs. Overarching optimism bias, irrational risk-taking behavior, recent emergence of the dominant species, the planet, making use of the above attributes, and replacement of all the other closely related evolutionary cousins with limited breeding. Okay, well, let's look at some supporting evidence, implications, and consequences. We've talked about denial of mortality. Reality denial gives rise to afterlife myths, religiosity, superstition, self-deception, overconfidence, risk-taking, and optimism bias. In fact, Tali Sherratt cited this, it had just come out in her book, and then subsequently write-up in the optimism bias. It turns out humans are irrationally optimistic about everything. You know the standard saw, right? That 90% of college students and 90% of college professors think they're above average, right? I mean, that keeps repeating itself. That's statistically improbable, but it's true. So I talked to Tali about this. In fact, there are other books you can read. Stumbling on Happiness. You know, Dan Gilbert shows that when people who 5 years ago either became paraplegic or won the lottery, you know who's happier today? The paraplegic, who has rationalized everything to saying, this was so good for me because I finally got to spend time with my family and everybody cares about me, etc., etc., etc. Folly of Fools, Robert Trivers is classic, of course, and Dan O'Reilly, predictably irrational. And the economists have now discovered this, that humans are very, very irrational. Overconfidence. Johnson and Fowler have done this. Theoretical evolutionary modeling shows that actually reacting in an overconfident manner can have fitness benefits as long as the contested resources are sufficiently large compared to the cost of competition. Especially when you've got full theory of mind, overconfidence can lead to success, right? Somebody sent me this after I wrote the book. There's a book, I don't have the actual book, he sent me the quotes. Formula One race car driving. Apparently, 25% rate of massive injury or death, lifetime. So you're trying to become a Formula One race car driver, and you know that your senior colleagues have had this 25% rate of death and danger. So you go back and ask them what happened. Being burned, these are the experts, was terrible. I never thought it would happen to me. Andretti, I thought it's not going to happen to me. Fittipaldi, you always think it'll happen to other drivers, not to you. Cooper, it's not going to happen to me. Stewart is a little more thoughtful. Someone else has the accident, but of course everyone's on the edge of disaster, even certain death. My field of medicine, epidemiologists are tearing their hair out. You know what you're supposed to do, right? Exercise, keep a good diet, don't smoke, don't get obese, treat your high blood pressure, find out if you have sleep apnea, treat it, take care of hygiene, and of course do better end-of-life care. None of this happens. A few of these things. I'm a physician. I don't even do half these things. It's not going to happen to me, right? Here is the most dramatic case, Steve Jobs. As some of you probably know, Steve Jobs had this concept of reality distortion field. People would tell him, Steve, that's not possible. He'd say, go off and distort reality and make it happen. That's why we have an iPhone. He got pancreatic cancer, contrary to the internet, not the kind that kills you, the kind that is completely curable. With simple surgery, he had been cured. He said, nobody's going to cut on me. And he decided to take enemas and herbal therapies and all kinds of things till it's too late. He killed himself, basically, by denying the reality of what he had. This is the smartest man in the world, right? So it shows you what reality denial, the flip side of reality denial. Denial of scientific reality. This is the biggest problem that we all face as scientists and thought leaders. I don't have to tell you about this one, biological evolution. I was just telling them I discovered by an anonymous poll that 15% of my medical students at UCSD don't believe in evolution. They're going to be your doctors. Isn't that scary? And of course, you know the statistics about politicians and Americans in general and so on. You know, and I don't know is the water now being fluoridated in San Diego yet, or they still don't? I think they still don't have it, because in the 1960s it decided that it was a communist plot. And so I think there's still no fluoride in the San Diego water. Herbal cures, of course. Not to say, many great medicines have come from herbs, but there's so much stuff that's just out there. Squirt your nose with this and you get off a plane and you won't get a cold. Forget the fact that your chance of getting a cold on a flight is 1 in 10,000 or something. But vaccines, they don't work. This is a really horrible thing happening right now. Vaccines are linked to autism. Forget the fact that the actual paper that claimed this has been shown to be false, and the man has been lost his medical license and been punished for his fraud. Oh no. Extremely intelligent, wealthy people in California, I'm not vaccinating my child, it's the mercury in there or something. Forget the fact that mercury has been removed since then, even if that. UFOs, of course, this is a famous one, right? So many people believe in UFOs, despite lack of evidence. Cancer risk, it's not going to happen to me. I work on red meat and cancer, and we have shown very clearly how red meat probably increases your risk of cancer. There's no question about it. One hamburger is 30 minutes of your life. You know what percentage of people in my lab eat red meat? 80%. These are the actual scientists who are studying the cancer. But this is the other reason I felt I had to finish this book. 2005, Danny Brower is writing. All this denial is fine. We'll get away with it. National debt, healthcare. We can fix these things. Environmental degradation, even some of the terrible religious wars. But one thing is going to get us, which we are denying. That's climate change. So this is from a Carter symposium we had recently. You might be interested to take a look at this over the human evolution. But let's look at the last 10,000 years, the Holocene, where the weather finally stabilized. We're living in this golden period, which occurs once every couple of hundred, about 100,000 years, give or take. Even less frequently than that. We're living in this golden period of the Holocene. We are here, and this may be where we're headed. This is the average number of extreme weather events per decade. By the way, you know where this is from? This is from the insurance companies. This is from the insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. That's where the best data on climate disasters are, because they really care about this. Zurich Re, Munich Re, look that up. Because they're tracking what's happening, and they're the ones that are alerting everybody. The climate scientists are trying their best, but they're being attacked inappropriately by many people. But this is a fact. As Mark Twain said, a man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. So this is actually just out of the Journal of Science just 2 weeks ago. This is the upcoming meeting that's going to happen shortly, I believe, in Paris. And this is the path that we need to stabilize the climate. This is the current national commitments with no change. And this is business as usual. So the bad news, the doctor says to the earth, is that you've got advanced stage humans. The good news is they've just about run their course, and you should be on the mend pretty soon. So anyway, just to finish up, I want to leave a little more time for any questions. I just want to point out that many things support this hypothesis. I talked about ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny, the optimism bias. This thing called the Pollyanna hypothesis, which I don't know too much about in the humanities, about how humans are irrationally optimistic. Turns out if you take all human languages, somebody did this, and search through the words in human language, optimistic words far outweigh pessimistic words in all human languages. Risk-taking and thrill-seeking behavior, of course. Now, I'm not saying that, when there's a tornado in the Midwest, I used to live there for a few years, all the animals disappear and the humans come out to watch the tornado. And not to say other animals don't take risks, but you might see a mountain goat jumping from crag to crag, practicing, or a bird, a hawk taking a dangerous dive. But you will never see a mountain goat trying to fly off a cliff like like humans do, right? Overconfidence, suicide, a uniquely human behavior. So there's this thing called depressive realism, one of the simple theories for major depressive disorder. It turns out that if you want to know the facts, talk to a depressed person. Depressed people are depressed, it appears, at least some psychologists, psychiatrists believe in this, because they're the ones that don't have this hopeless optimism that the rest of us have. And that eventually leads to suicide, a uniquely human phenomenon. By the way, to commit suicide, you have to know that you're a person who can die, but you also have to know that somebody else died, right? Otherwise, how can you translate it back to knowing that you died, right? So that fits. Major depressive disorder. Turns out depressive disorder can, just one shot of ketamine that just takes you out of reality for a little while can sometimes correct depression for periods of time. Autism spectrum disorders where there's no theory of mind or poor theory of mind have difficulty in understanding death, have difficulty in understanding the concept of God. Panic disorder maybe, meditation is another area that would be highly relevant. Then there's this thing called the end of history illusion. Imagine yourself in the past, and you can tell me all about how you progressed through your life and changed. Imagine yourself 20 years from now. I cannot imagine myself as being any different from what I am right now, right? I have all the information. I'm a physician. If you come up to me and say, hey, you're just over 60, and what's your risk of getting Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, heart attacks or cancer or having a major accident in the next 20 years? I'll say 2%. So you come back next day and say, hey, you went to medical school, right? You know that's about 70%. They come back and ask me next day, I'll say, 6%. So we can't imagine anything being different from what we have right now, especially if it's good. And there are many other features arising that, I had this chapter after Darwin, I wanted to call it Difficulties with the Theory. And the publisher said, you cannot have a chapter called Difficulties with the Theory. So I called it Future Directions. But there are many, many things that people can argue about, and the one that I'll just briefly mention before I finish, because people sometimes bring this up, is, oh, come on, I'm a rational human. I know the future, I know the statistics, I know the facts. I can deal with it. Why do I have to be worried about dying? That's because you're a human that has been through this wormhole, and you're here today. Imagine the first human. In fact, imagine this. Imagine the first woman who realized that her sister died in childbirth, or that babies are dying all the time, and that these were people like her. What would that do to the propagation of the species? Imagine any individual, the first individual, and that first individual is all alone, or maybe have one or two other companions. They don't have a history and statistics to rely on. So I think it's that first event you have to imagine. You have to imagine. It's very hard in evolution. I've been learning this myself, to imagine what happened in the past. And this is the idea. Okay, so this theory is consistent with all known facts. Anybody want to give me any fact that goes against this theory, I'd be happy to hear. It's compatible, actually, with all the other related theories about humans. I've not had a difficulty fitting it in. I don't have to put down any other theory to include this. It's not negated by any currently known facts that I know of, but it is not directly testable by experimental reproduction, except maybe in a 100-year experiment using crows or something like that. And it's not directly falsifiable by an experimental approach, as far as I know. If any of you have a way out of it, let me know. Okay, so I'll end there. That's the overall theory. Happy to hear about any questions you have on any of the three parts of what I talked about.